Hey, this is a look at Kamikaze, the Beatrice Garland poem. And you're probably encountering this in the context of AQA GCSE, where it's one of the power and conflict poems, where you'll be required to compare it with one of the other, or compare it to one of the other poems from the anthology. So as we go through, if you are in fact doing that syllabus, then be looking at poems and bits that it reminds you of out of the other different choices you've got. But I'm going to assume that you've read the poem, and I'm going to assume that you largely know what it means. And so we'll take it from an annotation point of view. Now, when you're annotating, write down not only any techniques or so, but also the really important thing is what it means. And if you can't remember any of the fancy terms or any of the vocab, it's far better to go for the effect and explain the effect so your reader, your examiner, knows that you know that the writer's made choices and those choices have a specific impact than it is to remember something like asyndactic listing. Okay, right. Looking at the title Kamikaze, then, you can see, first of all, I've put some kind of annotation in there as a precursor thing here. And I'd argue that when you come to the title, first of all, there is the whole idea of the kamikaze pilots. So these were pilots in the Second World War, Japanese pilots who were basically suicide pilots. Their mission was to fly their plane at certain targets, but they knew they were going to die in the process. And it was caught up in all sorts of concepts of honor and sacrifice and patriotism and heroism. So first of all, it's introducing us to the concept that is what he is meant to be doing. That was meant to be the defining moment of his life. But the second point there is he actually becomes defined by something he failed to do. So the poem might be called Kamikaze, but it was his failure to be a kamikaze pilot that has had this massive impact on the rest of his life. So, the title both establishes that concept, that principle, and then the rest of the poem kind of points out how difficult it is and how it didn't apply in this instance. Now, the next thing is the identity of the speaker. Now, if you're using lit charts, the narrative identity there, they talk about it being the daughter speaking. I think it's the granddaughter talking about her mother, and what you would have to do is work out what you think. If you're using lit charts, go through the rationale for that, go through kind of my rationale, go through your own rationale and work out who you think the speaker is. But I think this her father is talking about the speaker looking at her mother, rationalizing about her father. So the speaker is the granddaughter. So in my interpretation, I think we've got the granddaughter who is very eloquently thinking of her mother's recollection and her mother's kind of feelings and her own, and this idea that the two female generations are imagining the father's feelings, as well as giving us this idea of the whole community. So if you're comparing this poem to others thinking about the impact of war on individuals, you've got a number of individuals. If you're thinking about society's view of war, you've got a number of different layers, what the father thought, what the different generations of descendants thought, what the community thinks as a whole. Okay. Looking then at the first stanza, in fact, a little bit further than the first stanza, because you can see that we've got this whole big long sentence that carries on way beyond the bottom of this page at the moment. We look at the idea her father embarked at sunrise, and I find it interesting that the character of this poem, the kind of kamikaze pilot, or the would-be kamikaze pilot, is first of all defined as a parent, not as a soldier. So this is privileging, this is putting at the foreground his role in the family, even though he has lost his role in the family by his actions. Okay, because I mentioned before, if we look here, this poem, it's ironic. The poem makes you expect he'll do something and he doesn't, and it tries to put you in the position of those people, and you don't know exactly why he did it, because we can only assume, but we do know this role, it's his role as family man, and he would have been leaving behind a young family. So we've got this embark set off at sunrise with a flask of water. Sunrise normally has connotations of happiness and hope and new beginnings. This poem subverts those ideas, kind of challenges them, turns them upside down. This sunrise is an ending in so many ways. It's meant to be the end of his life, but actually it's the end of his metaphorical life. Kind of that decision marks the end of his relationship with his family in the way that he's known it. And it then lists what he's got with him: flask of water, practical, not least because, you'd have a bit of a dry mouth if you were going to fly your plane into something. But a samurai sword is that symbolic kind of warrior, the heroism kind of status. A shaven head full of powerful incantations. So this list of what he has kind of covers the spiritual as well as the practical. And it ends with enough fuel for a one-way journey into history, right? It is literally a one-way journey. It is his literal journey. He's going to his target. It is also an emotional journey that he discovers something about himself, that he doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to kind of do what's been asked of him. We can talk about a one-way journey into history as meaning, he's going to go into the kind of famous chronicles of these soldiers who died in war, who sacrificed themselves. But it could also be euphemistic. It could also be a euphemism. That's that softer term, kind of looking at a harsher kind of concept, that he is going to be history. He is going to be no more if this mission goes according to plan. And we get the enjambment and the enjambed lead into that conjunction on the next line to kind of think that he's going on, the enjambment, the decision's been made, we've got that flow, he's got, he's not meant to stop and question, he's carrying on with this. And then the conjunction at the start of this second stanza says, but halfway there, pause. Okay, that's caesura and the end stop, mimicking his kind of moment of reflection as he moves to history and to his target. And also this reflection of his daughter, because she is trying to justify this family story. He must have looked far down at the little fishing boats. So we have this kind of, the different layers of narrative. Nobody knows what actually happened because nobody's spoken to him, right? He's not talked about it. Nobody's talked to him. Once he goes back, they've not said, what happened? Why didn't you? Right? But you have this idea, she thought he must have looked down. This modal verb, yeah? This idea of, this has to be what happened. And what we get then is this celebration of the natural world, this idea that from his plane, where he is literally at that point a weapon, he is kind of this symbol of destruction and symbol of death. He must have looked down at fishing boats strung out like bunting. Okay, bunting is that, if you think of, that kind of stuff that you put out at a party, right? The bit with the little kind of flags, little flag things hanging down on it. So the fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath the marking in swathes like a huge flag. So lots of imagery there to do with celebration and patriotism, that love of country. But actually he is seeing the natural world calling to him, like this celebration, like these flags. And he heralds that call, or in his daughter's account of what must have happened, he heralds that call, because he sees the flag waving one way then the other in a figure of 8. If you think of a figure of 8, if you turn it on its side, that is the arubos. I think it's that. Is it arubos with a U in it? Okay, it's the infinity symbol. Anyway, it's got that idea of almost like a snake eating its tail. But it stands for infinity. He sees all of these symbols, all of these signs, the shoals of fishes flashing silver. These are not the flashing silver of the samurai sword. This is the flashing silver of the fish, their bellies moving towards the sun with all of its kind of connotations of light and hope and life and life-giving kind of ideas. So, there's this imagery which is kind of presenting nature as being prevalent, as being kind of the foreground of his thoughts. Conflict in these images like flashing silver, swords, samurai swords, kind of everything, darkness, they are all taking a back seat. And again, we've still got an awful lot of enjambment, an awful lot of this kind of rushing to an inevitable conclusion. When we get, an end stop here, it's giving us a moment to think, what are these things leading to? Well, it's leading to this other natural image. And eventually, and remember, we're still in the daughter's kind of idea of this. Eventually, it's he must have remembered how. And we get these images of family, we get the images of construction and protection. The kind of building of these defenses, the natural power of the sea, the plosives here, the pearl grey pebbles to see what withstood the longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat safe to the shore. This is why I think it's the granddaughter who is there. It's like a conversation, I guess, that bringing their father's boat, he's remembering. So the mother would be saying, yes, grandfather's boat, to the daughter, the granddaughter, who's the speaker, if that makes sense. But we've definitely got this image of kind of construction and family and creation, and the idea of safe homecomings. He must have remembered how important it was to protect family, that father came home safe. And yet he is out to kind of never come home deliberately. Just before I forget, I know I've gone past the kind of little note, free verse, the kind of structure thing. You will have noticed by now that we've got a free verse structure. So there is no discernible regular meter to it. There's no discernible rhyme scheme. I think we can argue the free verse is there for two reasons. First of all, that he doesn't follow expectations. He is liberated from those constraints, but also that his independence leads to him having a lack of structure and support within his life from that moment on. His family and his community quite explicitly at the end withdraw any interaction with him, any love and affection, because of what he's done or failed to do. Okay, so coming back up to kind of grandfather's boat, we've got that colloquial kind of tone. This is a story that maybe they've been over before. Yes, grandfather's boat, that they're telling each other, they're creating this narrative of what must have happened to cause this. We have the sibilance on the idea safe to the shore, salt sodden, awash, and the boat comes back in, awash with plenty. This listing, this asyndetic listing, that's the listing with commas, is where you have, the bounty of the natural world. Father would come home bringing all of this wonderful stuff. He's not going to come home. He's not going to have any of that connection. We also in the list get this idea of once, the tuner, the dark prince, muscular and dangerous. And I think that just checks in with some concepts of masculinity, honor and heroism that, this particular pilot, this father isn't going to necessarily fulfill, or is going to fulfill in a different way. He's going to come back to his family only to discover that his family don't want him. And to complement that, but earlier where things changed, we've then got this next conjunction starting a line, and though he came back, right? So the end stop, there's the end of that decision. Either he must have thought of these, and though he came back. So at this point, he's turned around. Though he came back, it's monosyllabic. It seems to represent this as such a simple thing that happened, and though he came back. But then you get the enjambment, leaving what happened, that sense of anticipation, that white space. Physically and emotionally, he came back, but my mother never spoke again in his presence. So his physical body kind of doesn't lead to, his emotional welfare being catered for. And you've got the language of negatives there: never, nor, no longer. Nobody would even look at him or speak to him. They treated him, the neighbors treated him as though he no longer existed. And the children, and you've got the kind of little bit of, the onomatopoeia there, or the onomatopoeic effect of the kind of consonants of the ch-ch alliteration, still chattered and laughed till gradually we too learned to be silent. So you have this movement of the children from innocence to experience, the idea that they don't know that he is to be shunned, that there is a stigma, that kind of taboo about what he's done, the idea that, the adults don't talk to him. And as they grow up, they learn you don't talk to him, right? So they learn to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. Right? And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die, because you've got a kind of literal death that he avoids, but a metaphorical death, a much more long, painful, prolonged and drawn out death. The way that this kind of final couplet puts it is actually, there's no doubt that he died that day. It's just how he chose to die. And he seems to have chosen this much more sort of torturous way of dying than would have been that sudden kind of physical death. Okay, I hope that helps. I think if you're looking at poems to compare it with, there's obviously poppies that you would look at, impact on individuals, impact on families, because you've got the different relationships there. I think I'd start to look at maybe sort of other poems like Remains and War Photographer, just in terms of the psychological impact on an individual or individuals. Ideas like, I think there's quite a lot of the natural imagery in there, if you wanted to link with something like Storm on the Island or Prelude. It really depends on what your direction is about it. If you got this as your chosen poem, think carefully, your named poem rather, think carefully about the keyword it's giving you and look at your options in terms of, is it going in on individual? Is it going in on family? Is it going in on psychological conflict? Is it going in on one moment in time? Because bayonet charge may be a good choice in terms of individuals, one moment in time, natural imagery. There's a lot to kind of link up. I hope this helps. Good luck.